7. But if you knew this third argument is also mentioned by Matthew alone. Christ conveys an indirect reproof to the Pharisees, for not considering why ceremonies were appointed, and to what object they are directed. This has been a common fault in almost every age, and therefore the prophet Hosea, 6:6, exclaims against the men of his own age for being too much attached to ceremonies, and caring little about the duties of kindness. But God declares aloud, that he sets a higher value on mercy than on sacrifice, employing the word mercy, by a figure of speech, for offices of kindness, as sacrifices include the outward service of the law. This statement Christ applies to his own time, and charges the Pharisees with wickedly torturing the law of God out of its true meaning, with disregarding the second table, and being entirely occupied with ceremonies. But a question arises, why does God declare that he is indifferent about ceremonies, when he strictly enjoined in his law that they should be observed? The answer is easy. External rites are of no value in themselves, and are demanded by God insofar only as they are directed to their proper object. Besides, God does not absolutely reject them, but, by a comparison with deeds of kindness, pronounces that they are inferior to the latter in actual value. Nor is it inconsistent with this to say, that in the perfection of righteousness the highest rank belongs to the worship of God, and the duties which men owe to each other occupy the second rank. For, though piety is justly reckoned to be as much superior to charity as God is higher than men, yet as believers, by practicing justice towards each other, prove that their service of God is sincere, it is not without reason that this subject is brought under the notice of hypocrites, who imitate piety by outward signs, and yet pervert it by confining their laborious efforts to the carnal worship alone. From the testimony of the prophet, Christ justly infers that no blame attaches to his disciples, for while God trained his people in the rudiments of the law, it was far from being his design to kill wretched men with famine. 8. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Some connect this sentence with a preceding statement, that one greater than the temple is in this place, ver. 6, but I look upon them as different. In the former case, Christ, by an allusion to the temple, affirmed that whatever was connected with his personal holiness was not a transgression of the law, but now, he declares that he has received authority to exempt his followers from the necessity of observing the Sabbath. The Son of Man, he says, in the exercise of his authority, can relax the Sabbath in the same manner as other legal ceremonies. And certainly out of Christ the bondage of the law is wretched, from which he alone delivers those on whom he bestows the free spirit of adoption, Romans 8:15. Mark 2:27. The Sabbath was made for man. This fifth argument is related by Mark alone. The general meaning is, that those persons judge amiss who turn to man's destruction, the Sabbath which God appointed for his benefit. The Pharisees saw the disciples of Christ employed in a holy work, they saw them worn out with the fatigue of the journey, and partly with want of food, and yet are offended that, when they are hungry, they take a few grains of corn for the support of their wearied bodies. Is not this a foolish attempt to overturn the purpose of God, when they demand to the injury of men that observation of the Sabbath which he intended to be advantageous? But they are mistaken, I think, who suppose that in this passage the Sabbath is entirely abolished, for Christ simply informs us what is the proper use of it. Though he asserted, a little before, that he is Lord of the Sabbath, yet the full time for its abolition was not yet come, because the veil of the temple was not yet rent, Matthew 27:51, Matthew 12:9. And having departed thence. This narrative and that which immediately precedes it have the same object, which is to show, that the scribes watched with a malicious eye for the purpose of turning into slander everything that Christ did, and consequently that we need not wonder if men, whose minds were so depraved, were his implacable enemies. We see also, that it is usual with hypocrites to pursue what is nothing more than a shadow of the righteousness of the law, and as the common saying is, to stickle more about the form than about the substance. First, then, let us learn from this passage to keep our minds pure, and free from every wicked disposition, when we are about to form a decision on any question, for if hatred, or pride, or anything of that description, reign within us, we will not only do injury to men, but will insult God Himself, and turn light into darkness. No man, who was free from malice, would have refused to acknowledge that it was a divine work, which those good teachers do not scruple to condemn. Whence comes such fury, but because all their senses are affected by a wicked hatred of Christ, so that they are blind amidst the full brightness of the sun. We learn also, that we ought to beware lest, by attaching undue importance to ceremonial observances, we allow other things to be neglected, which are of far higher value in the sight of God, and which Christ in another passage calls the more important matters of the law, Matthew 23:23, for so strongly are we inclined to outward rites, that we shall never preserve moderation in this respect, unless we constantly remember, that whatever is enjoined respecting the worship of God is, in the first place, spiritual, and, secondly, ought to be regulated by the rule which Christ has laid down to us in this passage.